Hello, welcome to Sale and Leaseback, how it works. In this video, we will be talking about sale and leaseback and how it works, strangely enough. I will be your host. My name is Will Ellis, and I'm the director and founder of BW Healthcare Surveyors. In this video, we will be talking about who BW Healthcare Surveyors are, for those of you who haven't come across us before, what exactly sale and leaseback is. We'll be talking about the pros and the cons of sale and leaseback. We'll be also covering transferring your contract to a new entity, which is slightly separate to a sale and leaseback, but can tie the two together. And we'll go through that in a moment or two. And we will then talk about who might potentially buy your surgery. So what type of investors might we be marketing to? Why potentially do a sale and leaseback now rather than waiting or putting it on ice? We'll be then talking about your long-term strategy. So how to maximize the value of your premises in anticipation of going through a sale and leaseback transaction. Then we will talk about what the process looks like. So if you were to go ahead with a sale and leaseback, how we could assist you or how a surveying firm could assist you through that process, what that process is and how it works. And then next steps, really. So a Q&A, how to get in touch with us should you have any questions or queries with regards to what we've just talked about today with regards to the sale and leaseback process, or want to ask about your unique and your particular circumstances around your surgery. So we will go through that right at the end. I'll let you know how best to contact us. Okay, so without further ado, in terms of who are BW Healthcare Surveyors, BWHS for short. So we offer help and advice to GP practices for all their property needs. So including things like notional rent reviews, so we can challenge notional rent reviews. We can assist practices through their notional rent assessments. We can undertake market valuations for partnership changes. We can set up leases for practices. We can do lease rent reviews, lease renewals. We do service charge disputes, asset management, and also sale and leasebacks as well, which brings us here today. Ultimately, we do anything to do with premises. Any premises issues that you might have, we will be able to assist you with them. And if we can't, we will certainly know somebody who can, be that a specialist accountant or specialist solicitor, architect, financial advisor, whoever it may be. We've got other connections here over many years of working in the sector for organisations who can assist you should we be unable to do so. Okay, and in terms of the kind of knowledge and experience we have, so we are now top ranked primary care surveying firm in the UK on Practice Index. Our team have over 100 years combined experience supporting GP practices. That's across six surveyors, including 2 recently appointed district valuers who's had 30 years experience each working for the NHS, who bring us invaluable expertise and knowledge of the sector. We have also assisted over 1,000 GP practices across the UK. That's since we set up back in 2017. So in just six short years, we've helped over 1,000 GP practices and hoping to assist thousands more over the coming years. All our surveyors are specialist primary care surveyors. So it's all we do on a day-to-day basis is help practices with their premises requirements, as mentioned a little bit ago. Okay, so that's enough about who BW Healthcare Surveyors. It gives you a bit of information to know that we kind of know what we're talking about when it comes to premises matters and specifically sale and leaseback. In terms of what is sale and leaseback, so sale and leaseback is where the GP owners would sell the property and simultaneously take a lease back from the purchasing party. So an investor would come in, buy the practice, put a lease in place. The GP partners would become tenants, but they would still obviously occupy the building and still provide contracted medical services. So in terms of what are the pros of sale and leaseback, what are the upsides, what are the reasons why practices decide to take this route and explore a potential sale and leaseback? The first one is your lease rent will be fully reimbursed by the NHS. So the rent that you pay the landlord is going to get 100% reimbursed by the NHS, as long as you use the correct representation to assist you through the process. So as long as you use surveying firms like ourselves and specialist solicitors, we will ensure that there are particular clauses inserted into the lease that ensure the rent that you pay the landlord cannot exceed the rent that you are getting reimbursed by the NHS. A sale and leaseback can also reduce the risk and the responsibility of property ownership. So under a traditional lease, the landlord would be responsible for the external repair and maintenance of the premises. So you'd no longer have to worry about that aspect. You would still, however, be responsible for the internal repair and maintenance of the premises because that is the tenant's obligation under the lease. There are, under certain circumstances, situations where the landlord may decide that they don't want to be responsible for the external repair and maintenance of the premises, and they may bat that back to you as tenants, to the tenants of the practice. If that is the case, then you can actually retain a proportion of the rent that you pay the landlord. So instead of paying in full the reimbursement that you receive, you will only have to pay perhaps 92, 95%. So you can retain somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of that rent, and you withhold that, put that into a sinking fund, and use that money to pay for any repairs and maintenance of the external part of the building, which should have been the landlord's responsibility. Sale and leasebacks can also remove or will remove the burden of ongoing capital investment. So you're going to get paid for the premises, the asset that you own, and that's going to mean that you are no longer responsible for any of the investment that is required to bring the surgery up to modern standards or extend the surgery, etc. So you'll no longer have that responsibility because you no longer own the premises. Number 4, so it can attract new GP partners. So this is probably the main reason why practices come to us interested in a potential sale and leaseback, because like every practice, it seems in the UK, practices are struggling to recruit GP partners, struggling to find partners, especially in owner-occupied premises where incoming GP partners are having to find hundreds of thousands of pounds to buy into what is sometimes a 10, 20, 30% share of a building. And doesn't seem to be many junior doctors, junior GPs willing to take that plunge. And the ones that are struggling to get mortgages to justify it with rising interest rates and things. That brings practices to go through a sale and leaseback process, because when you're a leasehold premises, incoming partners don't have to find funds to buy in. They just have to become signatories on a lease. It's not a magic wand, so there are still liabilities for that incoming GP partner. They still have to sign up to a long-term lease. They still have that liability of the long-term lease, but it's just a little bit easier when you're in a leasehold premises as opposed to an owner-occupied one. Number 5, so sale and leasebacks can also assist with improvement works or extensions or even new developments for your GP premises. So again, this is a big reason why practices come to us interested in a sale and leaseback, because they are perhaps in need of, or they're running out of space, they're in need of extensions, they're in need of modernisation, in need of money being spent on their premises to bring it up to modern standards, but they're struggling to self-fund that or struggling to get funding from the NHS to pay for it. So they can look at external investors who will come in, buy the premises on the proviso that they will spend X amount of money modernising and extending the surgery. So that can all be written into the sale and leaseback. So prior to that sale and leaseback going through, the investor has to spend money or has to agree and sign a contract to say they will spend money on the premises. And then the last one, you will also have protected rights for a new lease upon expiry of the lease. So when your lease expires, you will have an automatic right to renew the lease at the end, and it can be very difficult for the landlord to basically evict you. It tries to the clause is there to try and prevent landlords from just kicking you out and bringing a new tenant in. It's made very difficult for the landlord to do that, and you should have automatic rights at the end to renew under most circumstances. Okay, so they were kind of the pros, the upsides of sale and leaseback, some of the downsides of sale and leaseback, or certainly things that you're going to need to consider before deciding to go through a sale and leaseback process. Number one is leases can restrict what tenants do to the surgery. So if you were wanting to make any changes, upgrades, extensions, etc. to the surgery, it's not your premises anymore. So you're going to have to ask the landlord's permission to do that. They are also going to have to fund that as well. But if you went to them with ideas and aspirations to extend and upgrade the surgery, as long as that was going to increase the notional rent of the premises, a lot of landlords would be happy to consider those options for you, but you would always have to ask the landlord's permission to make any changes to the premises. Number two, so sale and leasebacks and leases specifically can place specific obligations on practices. So when you sign a lease, there may be a clause in there that says you have to redecorate the surgery every 3, 5, 10 years, whatever that is. There will certainly be a clause in the lease that says you have to keep the surgery in its current state of repair. So whatever the state of repair is on day one of the lease, that has to be the state of repair at the end of the lease. Otherwise, you can face financial penalties and issues upon expiry of that initial term. Number three, so responsibility under the lease, including rental payment. So what this means is, should the practice close or cease operating, then you will still be liable for the full terms of the lease, the full clauses of the lease, including the rental payments. So if the practice were to close, you would still have to make those rental payments to the landlord. Just to caveat that slightly, all leases should be and will be approved by the NHS as part of that process. So you do have an underwriting from the NHS to say they are agreeing to pay the rent for the term and for the duration of that lease. So if for whatever reason the practice closes is an NHS's decision, then you should have some sort of protection from them for them to pay the remainder and pay you out of the lease. For example, if they wanted to move you to a new health centre, they were building the health centre, then it'd be their obligation to look at having to pay you out of that lease before that move went ahead. That'd be a negotiation you could have with the NHS. However, if the reason for the practice closing was a GP partner's decision, then that's when you're going to face difficulties. That's when there are going to be issues with having to repay the lease under the lease terms for the remaining years of the lease. Number four, a big one, early redemption penalties. So a lot of mortgage providers, Aviva are one of the biggest culprits, will charge early redemption penalties when you sell the surgery and pay back the mortgage early, basically. So it's always worthwhile speaking to your mortgage provider and finding out what the potential early redemption penalties are, because they can sometimes be astronomical. But a simple phone call to your mortgage provider will give you the answers that you require. Number five, so you must have at least 2 signatories on the lease at all times. So let's say you've got 5 GP partners. 5 GP partners are happy to sign the lease when you first go through a sale and leaseback transaction, happy to sign up to a 10 or a 15-year lease. Technically, the first 3 of those 5 can remove themselves from the lease without having to find somebody to replace them. But when you get down to those last 2 signatories, those last 2 GP partners on the lease, that's when you're going to face difficulties. And that second to last GP that decides to leave is going to have to find somebody to replace them on the lease. Otherwise, they're going to have to stay on the lease and remain liable for the full terms of the lease. So that's worth considering as well. Always ensure there's at least 2 GP partners. If you're a single-handed practice with 1 GP, the likelihood is you're going to need to find another incoming GP who's happy to sign up to that long-term lease. There's going to be very, very few investors that are going to be willing to pay buy a surgery with just one signatory on the lease. Number 6, potential tax implications. So this is an accountant's issue, but it's something worth mentioning. So before you go through a sale and leaseback, it's always worth having a conversation with your accountant to understand what the tax implications are of selling the surgery and putting a lease in place. So capital gains tax is one. Just understanding how much you're going to have to pay effectively in tax to sell the surgery and set up a lease. Okay, so that's kind of it for the upsides and the downsides of sale and leaseback. Hopefully you've got a few more. You understand a little bit more about the issues that practices are facing at the moment, the reasons why practices are going through sale and leasebacks, and the things to consider when you go through a sale and leaseback. Something slightly different in terms of transferring the contract to a new entity. So on the back of perhaps thinking about the fact you've got to have 2 signatories on the lease at all times. Let's say there is just one GP partner. Like I said, there's going to be very few investors willing to sign to buy a surgery with just one GP partner on the lease. But there are things you can do to resolve that issue. So if you're nearing retirement and can't find a suitable replacement to take over the surgery, you can explore a few possibilities, such as, so your local PCN or GP federation may be willing to take over the surgery, take over the contract and be signatories on the lease. That would be perfectly acceptable to an incoming investor. Similarly, you could have perhaps a similar local practice could take over the surgery through a practice merger or practice acquisition, whichever one it was. So the 2 practices could come together, and the incoming practice could again become signatories on the lease, and their GP partners would be signatories on the lease and hold the contract. So that is an option as well. The third one is third-party organisation. So failing perhaps a GP federation or a PCN or another local GP surgery is willing to take over, there are specialist third-party organisations who can come in and do just that, take over the GP contract and become signatories on the lease. And again, all these options are perfectly acceptable to an incoming investor. The last option is the NHS themselves, although those of you who have spoken to the NHS about this probably understand that this really is a last resort, and the NHS will probably assist you with exploring the other options prior to them being willing to take over the practice. And that is really seen on a case-by-case basis. They wouldn't be willing to take over all practices, but if your particular practice was seen as being essential to the local community and there were very few other surgeries in the local vicinity, for example, then that's when an NHS may be willing to take over the contract, should you be unable to find an alternative solution. But certainly exploring the top 3 is very, very important. And like I said, there are a lot of third-party organisations who can more than willing to come in and take over this surgery. Okay, so that's it in terms of transferring the contract. If you're in that situation, that might be worth exploring. We can certainly assist you with that process if required. Now, in terms of who might buy the surgery, so the investors that we have on our books, so we have over 100 investors and agents on our database, all of whom are specialist, or the majority of whom are specialist investors who already know the sector, who already own GP practices up and down the country. They also understand the issues facing the sector and the needs and requirements of GP practices, and they're fully aware of the premises cost directions and the rent reimbursement scheme as well. So it just makes that relationship between landlord and tenant run as smoothly as possible, because they've already gone through that process. They already own GP practices and understand all the nuances around general practice at the moment. It just assists with that process. It also makes the process of selling the surgery to somebody who's already purchased a GP practice before, makes that process easier as well. From an investor point of view, primary care is seen as a very, very safe investment because it's government backed, because you've got the notional rent scheme, which is effectively paying the rent on your behalf. It is seen that the tenants are highly unlikely to default on their rent payments, which is why there are so many investors coming in from other sectors at the moment for the security of the government backed scheme that you get in primary care. Okay, so that kind of leads us quite nicely actually to the next slide in terms of why potentially do it now. So we are still seeing very high levels of demand for primary care assets. So despite the uncertainty in the market at the moment, there is still a lot of interest for primary care assets. Perhaps the value of surgeries has taken a bit of a hit over the last 6 to 12 months. So perhaps you won't be getting as much for the surgeries you would have done if you had gone through the process in 12 months ago. But that doesn't mean that there's not as much interest. There are still plenty of interest in surgeries up and down the country. Plenty of investors flooding into the market at the moment. So it's still a very, very good time to sell. Also, the sale under a sale and leaseback, the value of your surgery under a sale and leaseback is going to be valued a little bit higher than it would be if you just had a partnership change, for example. So if you've ever had a partnership change, ever had your surgery valued for partnership change purposes, under a sale and leaseback scheme, you're going to get a little bit of a premium on top of that value. And the main reason for that is because you've got that assigned lease against the premises. So because the incoming investor can see there's a 15-year lease or a 10-year lease attached to the premises, they will see that their investment is secure, their rental income is secured for that period of time. So unlike in an owner-occupied premises where there's no guarantee that that surgery is going to remain open and those rental payments are going to remain, under a leasehold premises, you're not just buying the surgery, you're buying the attached lease as well. So also worth considering is the longer the lease is, the higher the value of the premises is going to be. So in terms of maximizing the value of your premises, it's worth considering and trying to sign up to a longer term lease as possible. If you're thinking of a 10-year lease, if you can stretch to 15 years, it's going to add value to the premises. And if you're thinking of 15 years, if you can stretch to 20 years, again, it's just going to add value. So the longer you can sign up for, the better. That is on the proviso that the NHS, of course, approve that length of lease. You may want to sign up to a 20-year lease, and the NHS may be only willing to agree to a 10, 15-year lease. That's a different story. We'll just have to negotiate between the parties to get you the best possible deal that suits everyone. But we can talk about that when we go through the process. And then the last reason to think about selling your surgery now rather than perhaps waiting is to do with the signatures on the lease. So if, let's say you're thinking of signing a 15-year lease, if you sign up to a 15-year lease now, but you've only got 2 partners because 4 have just left, then all of a sudden you're going to have to try and find incoming partners to sign up to the whole duration of the lease. But if you've got 5 partners and none of them are expected to leave within the next 5-10 years, when one of them finally decides to leave, that incoming partner is only having to sign up for the remaining years of the lease. So if everyone stays for 5 years and you sign up to a 15-year lease, the incoming partner is only going to have to sign up for the remaining 10 years. And if everyone stays for 10 years, that incoming partner is only going to have to sign for the remaining 5 years. So ultimately, from that regard, the sooner you can go through a sale and leaseback, the better, really. So if you can preempt potential retirements and GP partners leaving, not always possible, I appreciate, but if you can to some degree and you can plan ahead, then it's worthwhile doing a sale and leaseback before you get to that stage. The biggest thing is whether you want to do a sale and leaseback at all, and only yourselves, a GP partnership and a practice, can make that decision. But if the answer is yes, you're going to do a sale and leaseback at some point, I can't see any reason why you would put it on ice. You might as well just get the ball rolling and try and get it sorted out sooner rather than later. Okay, so how to maximize the value of your premises. So obviously we've talked about the sale and leaseback side of things. Now, before you go through a sale and leaseback process, it's worthwhile looking at things that you can do to maximize the value of the premises. And it's certainly something we would do before taking you through that process. So when we go out to value the premises, we will look for these little things to see if we can sort these things out to maximize the value before we go to market. So the first one is your notional rent. So always ensure that your notional rent is checked by an independent surveyor. To be fair, you should be doing that anyway, even if you're not going through a sale and leaseback process. It's always worthwhile getting a second opinion from an independent surveyor, such as ourselves, just to make sure that the notional rent that is being proposed by the NHS is in line with the current market. Make sure you're not getting underfunded. So that is a real good way of maximising the value of the premises, but equally, it's a good way of just increasing the rental income that you are currently receiving for the surgery. The next point is to ensure that any lease agreements and rental amounts are up to date. So if you lease any space out in the surgery to a dentist or a pharmacy or a physio, whatever that may be, it's just ensuring that those leases are up to date. So making sure those leases haven't expired and making sure that if there's any rent reviews outstanding, that they are undertaken, because again, maximizing that rental income is going to maximize the value of the premises. The second point is ensure you are making the most of any spare space or non-reimbursable areas. So I appreciate there aren't many surgeries who have any spare space, but if there are, if you have spare space, or if you have space in the surgery that isn't currently getting reimbursed for notional rent, it's worth either A, trying to get approval for that reimbursement for the space that isn't currently included in your notional rent. Or if it's spare space, if you don't need it for GMS for notional rent purposes, then it's perhaps worth considering renting that space out to a third party that we've just talked about, perhaps a pharmacy, a dentist, a physio, a chiropractor, whatever that may be, and looking at tying them into a long-term lease for that space, because they're going to pay a rent, and a rental increase is going to increase the value of the premises. The next point, so in terms of upgrading and improving your surgery. So as I mentioned quite a while ago in the pros of sale and leaseback, a lot of investors are very keen at the moment in upgrading and improving surgeries because it's going to maximise their notional rent return. It's going to maximise the value of the premises. So if you can do that yourselves before you go through a sale and leaseback, then it's potentially you that's going to benefit from the increase in rental income and the increase in capital value. So if there are upgrades and improvements that you can make to the surgery, it's perhaps worth contemplating doing those prior to going through a sale and leaseback process. And equally, the same applies for extensions. So going to that next level, rather than just upgrading and improving your existing footprint, perhaps consider extending. And again, that's going to increase the value of the premises through increased notional rent. Okay, so what is the process? So if you think this all sounds great, I want to go ahead with a sale and leaseback, but I don't understand the process, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk you through exactly how the process would work. So the first thing that we would do as a surveyor, or if you employed a surveyor, first thing a surveying firm would do is arrange for a surveyor to go out and inspect the property and give you an idea of what the surgery is worth on the open market. What we do in terms of going that extra mile is we won't just tell you what the surgery is worth on the open market and what the value of the premises would potentially be. As I've mentioned, we will also talk about how to maximise that value. So we'll have a look at any outstanding leases. We'll review those for you. We'll review your notional rent and advise whether the notional rent is in line with the current market. Have a look at the surgery, see if there are any improvements that can be made, see if any extensions are feasible, all that sort of thing. So we'll do that initially. Come back with a report with what you can do to maximise and what the current value is, etc. From then, you can make a decision on whether you want to proceed. And if you did, then it's a case of us drafting the heads of terms for a new lease. So through discussions with the partnership, understanding exactly what you are going to be happy signing up to, the length of the lease, what your repair obligations will be. Once we've determined that, we will get the lease drafted, and we will ensure that those heads of terms are agreed and approved by the NHS, which is a vital stage of the process, ensuring that you've got NHS approval, because without it, then you're going to struggle to have rent reviews throughout the lease, and you can face issues during the lease process. So it's very, very important that before you go through a sale and leaseback process, before you go to market, that the lease has been approved and agreed by the NHS. Once you've got the green light from the NHS, then it's a case of going to market, marketing the surgery to all our investors, and then negotiating with any interested parties to get you the best possible price or best possible deal from the incoming investors. And then it's a case of seeking final approvals from all parties and completing the sale and leaseback process for you. And that is it. That is how the process works. Everything's been completed. And everything's been done at that point. And that brings this video to a close. So I'm hoping I've covered everything. If I haven't, if there's anything I haven't covered, or if you want any extra advice, or if you've got any more concerns or want something explaining that we have already gone through, basically, if you've got any questions or queries about a sale and leaseback process or anything at all that we've covered today, even if it's nothing to do with notional rent, even if it's nothing to do with sale and leaseback, but it's notional rent related or premises related, basically get in touch with us. So if you want to send us a letter, it'd be very unique. We don't get many of those these days, but if you did, that's our address. That's actually my direct line. So 0114 442 0098 is my direct line. our email address there, and then you've got our website as well, where there's a contact form, an inquiry form where you can get in touch via the website as well. So multiple ways of getting in touch with us. So yes, if you've got any questions, please don't be shy. Just get in touch. More than happy to have a conversation and talk about perhaps your unique situation in the surgery. Every surgery is different. So we can talk about the exact issues that you're facing, the exact reasons why you're contemplating going through a sale leaseback option, and something slightly different. We can also talk about what your other options are in rather than a sale and leaseback. So perhaps just putting a lease in place, etc., which is probably another video that we need to put together at some point. But any questions like that, just do get in touch. Okay, thank you for listening and have a great day.